First chapter.
A look into the past. An endless expanse of land stretched out beneath the weight of the dark clouds that hovered in the sky in their slow serenity, crossing the lands that were so close and yet so far. They came from the west, from the vast ocean that separated the different worlds, bringing with them the warm air of distant lands. The ice left over from the last harsh winter was already thawing as the pleasant wind moved across the continent, and the sun kept managing to part the narrow network of clouds and reach through them to the earth, where life was awakening more and more. But winter could not be driven away from everywhere. Far beyond the area that was gradually awakening from hibernation, so far that not even the warm wind survived, lay a dark land where it was so quiet that time seemed to stand still. Dark forests and high, sharp mountain ranges covered the entire region, and the snow never completely disappeared from the cold, hard forest floor. No life moved among the trees, no bird call or sound could be heard in the dark bushes, and even the rain seemed to fall more slowly here than on the rest of the mainland. This land was called Elytra. It was the dark spot of the otherwise magnificent and bright continent. As if separated by an invisible barrier that allowed no light to pass through, it was separated from the other lands where life was slowly returning and the grass was turning green as it gradually shed the frost of the cold season. In the largest and strongest country, which lay in the golden middle between its neighboring countries and touched the vast ocean to the west, people welcomed the gradual arrival of spring. This land bore the name of Corinth, and it took advantage of being the link between the surrounding nations. To the north bordered the great and rich land of merchants and artists, Adriel, which was immeasurably inferior to the other countries because of its barely existing government and low fighting strength. By an old agreement, which in the history books is already so many chapters back, they were subject to the government of Corinth, which since then additionally supervised the trade between Adriel and their trading partners. This only served Corinth as an advantage and furthered their strength and financial security, but not all neighboring nations were happy with this development. While dark Elytra remained true to its iron silence and almost lifeless in its position, there was one last country with which Adriel and Corinth shared the continent. This land was called Rhodes and was located in the south, where the sun shone highest. Rhodes was the land where the sun spent both its rising and setting day after day. It was the only land that was a rival to Corinth, and therefore there were always problems between the two great nations. This was not only because Rhodes did not consider Corinth's domination of Adriel's life to be just, but they had to watch Corinth grow stronger and stronger, while they themselves were worried about losing out at some point. Therefore, the only two royal houses on the continent, the royal houses of Corinth and Rhodes, were constantly facing each other in a passive and silent competition that occasionally slightly shook the peace that actually existed between them. In addition, the past shaped the relationship of the different countries, because just a few decades ago there was a severe and all-consuming war, the traces of which have not yet faded completely. Despite the fact that it still lingered in people's memories, however, it was considered a well-kept secret. Only the older generations that were still alive knew about the horrible images that were burned into their minds, while the younger generations grew up ignorant and peaceful. They were never to know of the horrors of war and the violent and cold orders of royalty that drove numerous families apart and left more scars in the earth than any individual could survey. But this was not to last. The battle was not yet over. In secret, hidden in high mountains and dark caves, the memories remained and plans were being developed to be able to come to terms with what had happened once and for all, regardless of those who were to be brought to ruin by these plans. All was still quiet, children played inattentively and safely in the many towns and villages, and in the bars and pubs people told each other inebriated stories of great achievements. No one suspected that the experiences, which were only a few decades past, would soon be repeated. Chapter 2. The Promise. Carelessly, the tall figure wrapped in a thick cloak dropped the heavy luggage she had carried on her shoulders all the way across Surmaz. Dully it came to rest on the ground before she straightened up, took a deep breath, and briefly stretched her neck. "Oh. See Kuno, there you are." That went fast, heard it stammering behind Kuno, as a person trotted through the tall and heavy front door outside into the cool breeze of winter. He didn't even have to turn around, because he knew the person who had come in well enough. It was Henry's henchman, his right-hand man, so to speak, though Kuno had never felt that he would take on any task that lay outside the safe four walls of Henry's quarters. Even now, he could almost smell the anxiety from him as he let his gaze slide over the vast capital in front of him, which almost seemed to glow in the setting sun. The sandy ground and the beige color of the many houses only emphasized this effect. "Just take him away, Artur." "I have to go to Henry's," Kuno gave him back only briefly, and with a little sigh, before he already turned around and walked towards the massive wooden door, which he opened a little later. He heard another quick "why yes." Of course, behind him, and imagined in his mind the image of slender Artur struggling to lift the weight of his small gift. But that didn't stop him from walking without hesitation into the huge building, which looked more like a small castle than an ordinary apartment building. He pulled his scarf from his face and took off his heavy hood as the warmth enveloped him, which immediately caused the snow that had previously been on his hood to land on the light stone floor below. The ice also slowly thawed on the rest of his heavy, dark cloak, gradually exposing the fabric as the echo of his footsteps reverberated off the high, bare walls around him, and the warmth rose deeper and deeper into his body. He knew exactly where he needed to go. For years he had been constantly on the same path through this large house, and he never encountered a person other than Artur. It was not until he crossed the great hallway and opened another heavy door that the picture of a huge hall appeared before him, in which there was always the same person, just sitting in his usual place in the orange light of the sunset. "Ah, Kuno. Good that you are here," immediately greeted him the voice of Henri, which was significantly different from that of Artur. There was no fear in his tone, let alone any form of respect. He was calm and serene, against a background of quiet menace that made Kuno understand again and again that he was nothing more than a simple henchman to him. "Henri. The job is done." Kuno's greeting kept rather short. There was nothing else to say, and if he was honest, he wanted to get back outside as soon as he could. Just the sight of Henry's now wrinkled face, from which he nevertheless looked at him awake and penetrating, robbed him of his energy. This was exactly how he had met him before. Even then, many years ago, when Kuno first landed with Henri, he was an older, rather lanky man with short gray hair and an almost expressionless and serious look. And yet he never lost his aura, which earned him the respect of those around him, nor did the fire in his eyes ever die out. Now, he slowly rose from his seat at a large table overflowing with books and papers, which stood on a slight rise at the end of the room, calmly clasped his hands together and stepped with a firm step in front of the huge table, from where he turned again in Kuno's direction. Even as he did so, he began to answer him. "Good. I had quite a few expectations, but once again you've exceeded even the highest of them. Where did you find him?" "He was in hiding. He's been lodged in the basement of a merchant who's been the subject of frequent rumors lately. It was just a lucky hit." But at these words Henri immediately began to laugh softly, which made the little threat temporarily disappear from his expression. "A lucky shot, then. By now I don't believe anything you say is a lucky shot. Our good training is simply paying off, just as it should." At the sudden energy that rose in his voice, something else suddenly interrupted the two of them, drawing Kuno's attention to the side. But it hardly alarmed him, as it was a familiar sound. The large Rottweiler that Henri had acquired a few years ago sat erect in his spot at the edge of the hall, quietly whimpering as he watched them. You could tell by the look on his face that he was just barely restraining himself from running off to check Kuno out, but his docility to Henri outweighed his own desire. Kuno immediately turned away again and concentrated on Henry's further words, which immediately followed, for the latter also paid little attention to the dog, which sat only a few feet away from them. And what became of the merchant? He wasn't there. He is on a trip to Audriel to procure goods to sell here. He had nothing to do with it. It was his wife who hid him. Curiosity flashed in Henry's wary eyes then. Oh yeah? And what became of the wife? Kuno didn't even hold back in his answer. He had been doing Henry's missions for so long that the latter could judge him well by now. Nothing, he answered simply, which made Henry's look even more curious. However, he didn't say anything, so Kuno continued right away. She bears no guilt for the traitor's actions. It is enough if he is punished for it. She also has a son, someone has to take care of him. Oh, that wouldn't be the problem. All at once the curiosity falls from him, and the old familiar composure, almost boredom, returned to his expression as he turned away from Kuno and turned to the table behind him to let his gaze glide over the many papers. I guess you'll never change. With an attitude like that, you'll end up in a dead end eventually. Nice people don't get far these days. You know that, don't you, Kuno? If you let too many innocents alive, you can't be surprised if one of them eventually plunges a knife into your back. But Kuno didn't answer anything in response. They've had this conversation a few times, however. Each time he only became more sure of never letting innocent people pay for what others have indulged in. He had already experienced too much for that. Henri, however, probably didn't expect an answer either, because he suddenly changed the subject, showing Kuno that he wouldn't be here too much longer. Anyway, I have a new task for you. This one is more difficult than the previous ones and, as it were, more important. I trust that you are the right choice for this mission. Chapter 3. What is it about? There was no immediate answer. Instead, it remained silent for a few seconds while Henri let his gaze wander over the letters that lay before him on the crowded table. Again Kuno heard the soft whimpering of the dog from the side, but he continued to pay no attention to it. Instead, he averted his gaze and looked toward the windows that punctuated the huge, light-colored stone walls that rose up around them and coalesced into a cross vault above them. The incoming warm light of the sunset spread a pleasant atmosphere throughout the large and otherwise drab and colorless hall. For a moment, time no longer mattered as Kuno gazed at the pattern cast by the orange sunlight on the opposite wall. A strange calm came over him at the sight. It was only when he gradually turned his focus back to Henri a little later that he saw him step from the rise in front of him and walk slowly toward the dog, who immediately fell silent and looked intently in his direction. It's about a woman who recently escaped. She is also from Sermaz. Maybe you have even met her before, began Henri his explanations, while his steps already slowed down again. Still a few meters away from his dog, he stopped and watched it calmly, while it twitched its ears briefly and leaned forward for a moment, on the verge of walking towards Henri. But still he remained steadfast, and thereupon paused in his position, puzzled. Her name is Helene. She was part of the royal guard. In fact, she was very close to the king, and was one of his most loyal subordinates for a long time. At this, Kuno even recalled some rumors he had heard over and over again over the past few years. There were hardly any women in the king's guard, just as there were hardly any other female soldiers. Therefore, it was no wonder that word spread like wildfire throughout the cities that a woman, of all people, had made it into the king's closest entourage. Of course, he had already heard about her. He even imagined that he had seen her a few times on the streets of Sermaz when they were both out on a job. Since Henri did not continue on his own, Kuno inquired about the rest of the information himself. What happened? Well, I keep telling you that you can't trust anyone, right? You could recommend that to the king too. Sean is not like his father. He takes too many risks when it comes to protecting his own position. Another deep sigh ran through Henri before he turned back to Kuno. By now it was getting progressively darker in the large room as the light gradually dimmed. She turned against Corinth and one day made an assassination attempt on the king. A few days ago, one night, she freed a considerable number of prisoners from the dungeons, and even the other deputies of the guard were too late. Some of them lost their lives trying to stop her. However, she finally managed to escape without approaching the royal family again. If you ask me, that wouldn't have been bad either. It would have increased their bounty immeasurably. They're still busy trying to make up for the damage she did. At this, Henri couldn't help but grin a little as he now began to walk towards Kuno with a steady and sure stride. What is my task in this? Your task? That's obvious, isn't it? You've been doing missions like this long enough, my dear. I don't think I need to explain it to you anymore. He was right about that. Of course he knew what to do. But one question still remained unanswered. Do you want her alive? And directly Henri's little grin changed into an almost friendly smile. If Kuno didn't know what they were just talking about, he wouldn't expect Henri to have anything bad in mind. His expression was almost warm and full of satisfaction as he calmly answered him. It doesn't matter. The important thing is that you bring her to me, no matter what it costs. But if you think about it, it would certainly be easier for you if she didn't resist, wouldn't it? And besides, that's how she would end up anyway. Once we hand her over to the royal court, the maximum punishment awaits her. A few measly days more won't change that. Kuno's expression barely changed at Henri's words, and he showed nothing of what was happening inside him. He still felt a dark mist of distaste rising inside him whenever Henri gave him such a task, but he had long since stopped rebelling against it. He knew he could not escape his fate. And Henri knew that too. It's just one mission of many. You make life easier in this country by ridding it of impending dangers, and I know that's what you want, right? A safe life for the many people who are in Corinth and the surrounding lands. His smile slowly receded at these words, however, it did not escape completely. Gradually, only the expression in his eyes became more serious again, and Kuno knew before he even uttered it what he was about to be reminded of again. Wouldn't you wish for something like that, and consequently ignore your missions? Well, then maybe the royal court would find out that you are also a danger to this country. And maybe even other people would find out about your existence who shouldn't necessarily know. You know what I'm talking about, right? Momentarily, Kuno's gaze became more serious as well, and after a brief, tense silence, he nodded briefly in response before lifting his hands to pull his hood back over his now rather long brown hair. It already reached almost to his shoulders. With this gesture, he was already getting ready to leave the great hall again. He had received his assignment and would now ask around for information about this Helene, hoping to find a lead soon. Another conversation with Henri made no sense now anyway, because he had nothing to reply on the last point. Henri had complete power over him there, however reluctantly he admitted it. And so he turned and began his first steps toward the massive wooden door that separated him from the hallway. The brief sunset had already passed by now, and no more orange rays of light filled the room. The warm atmosphere was gone. Instead, the high walls around him became dreary and cold again, and he also felt the chill of the melted snow on his heavy coat again. In the gathering darkness, Henry's more serious side also came more strongly and impressively to the fore again. "One other thing before you go," his voice sounded behind him one last time, while Henri was already making his way back to the large table. His tone was expressionless, without any emotion. "If you come near the border of Ilitra on your way, listen around there. Recently it has been said that the renegades who live there have created their own religion, or something along those lines. The people there are said to be blindly following the idea of a powerful god living among them. If you find out anything about that, let me know." Having already arrived at the massive door, Kuno looked for a brief moment at his hand, hidden in a glove, resting on the doorknob before turning back to Henri and looking into his waiting face for a moment. Another simple yes followed from him before he opened the door and made his way out, again surrounded by the echo of his own heavy footsteps and the increasing darkness of the night. Chapter 4. Royal Family. The sun had just risen over the great capital of Corinth when the many streets were already filling. All of Surmaz awoke from its sleep as the warming light fell on the snow that had spread over the rooftops and alleys during the long night. The silence was broken by single, thickly wrapped people who pushed the snow to the roadside and cleared their house entrances. After that, the doors of the many merchants were already opening, setting up their stalls and preparing their stores for the day, before the children also found their way outside and enjoyed the mountains of snow that had just been pushed together. Little by little, the nightly quiet was saying goodbye, giving way to the everyday bustle of the big city. More and more people could be seen on the streets as the sun rose higher. Sleepy greetings and short conversations were heard everywhere, interrupted only by the laughter of children and the occasional little tantrums of merchants whose stalls were hit by the snow the children tossed about in their battle. There was also already some activity outside the large castle of the royal family. Although it was still early in the morning and therefore quite cold, 2 children were running around on the wide street in front of the huge building, infecting the surrounding people with their joy. A small dog, a brown and white King Charles Spaniel, kept them company and followed them wherever they went. "Hannah! Look what I found!" suddenly exclaimed one of the 2 children, a 5-year-old blond boy with long hair and bright blue eyes, who was kneeling on the ground and lifting something out of the snow. Hannah, the girl of the same age with brown, slightly curly hair, immediately turned to him with her big brown eyes. "What?" "Toma, come with me." Immediately, the little dog at her side barked in response and the 2 of them ran over to Aiden, who slowly stood back up, not even bothering to knock the snow off his pants. "Here, look. Isn't he beautiful?" greeted Aiden to the 2, his eyes on his hands as he still breathed a little heavier from running around just now. Hannah quickly came to his side, almost tripping over Toma, who was happily running in circles around the 2. But she only giggled softly as she awkwardly had to stop for a moment to let him through before turning to Aiden. "What do you have there?" "A rock. But it's beautiful." Only now did Aiden turn his bright blue eyes directly to Hannah, and in response held out to her the small stone that was in his hands. The occasional person walking past them completely ignored the 2 as they focused on their find. Hannah carefully took the small stone from him and then looked at it as it lay in her open hand. It was just half the size of her palm and was round and flat, without any edges or corners. "It's just as white as those flowers you like so much," still agreed Aiden too, with his innocent tone, while he watched her inspecting the stone. You could see a small trace of nervousness in his eyes as he waited patiently. He hoped that she would find it as beautiful as he did. But by then Hannah began to smile and nodded before looking up at him with her dark brown eyes. "Yes, it's really beautiful. Just as white as my flowers." And immediately, a happier expression spread across Aiden's face again as well. "Exactly. Take it with you. Then you won't forget me when you're gone." But then Hannah had to laugh softly again and quickly shook her head. "I won't forget you after all. But, all right, I'll take him with me. Then I can give him back to you when we get back." At that, Aiden nodded contentedly as well, and was about to respond when they were interrupted by a shout, however. "Hannah? Come on, we have to go." Wide-eyed, the little girl straightened to the side and saw a carriage standing at the edge of the wide road, in front of which 3 people were just talking. One of them had turned to the 2 children and was now looking at Hannah expectantly. "Aiden, I have to go. But we'll be back soon. I'll take the stone with me." She looked over at the boy again, who nodded with a little gloom in his expression, before she spun around and ran over to her mother, who had just called her. As she did so, she lowered the stone safely into her pocket. "There you are. Come on, we have to get in." She was greeted by her mother, who also immediately held the door of the carriage open for her. She was a young, strong woman, full of energy and zest for her coming journey. "You go on in. I'll have a quick word with your father, and then we'll be on our way." And so she did. While little Hannah was already climbing into the carriage, she turned to the 2 men standing in front of her, making the final arrangements. "How long will you be on the road?" "What do you think?" One of the grown men, with long dark hair, a full beard and a determined look, just asked the other. The answer came from a slightly older, experienced and stocky man, with shoulder-length blonde hair and an equally full beard. His serious expression was drawn from the many experiences he had already had in his life. "You know that, Sean. It will take us about half a day to get to Ellingen. We'll take a break there and look around the market before we leave for Woollands in the morning. We probably won't get there until the evening, so we'll be heading back the next day. You can expect us to be back here in about 3 or 4 days." Good," replied Sean, taking another deep breath before nodding a few times. "Take good care of them then, Antonio. You never know who or what might be lurking out there. But of course, don't worry about them. They'll be safe with me." The burly man put his hand on Sean's shoulder once more before turning away and walking forward to the horses to check that all was safe. It wasn't until he was a little ways away from them that Sean finally turned to his wife. "Jenna, take care of yourselves, okay? I wish I could have come with you to make sure nothing happened to you." "Oh, nonsense," replied Jenna immediately, however, as a smirk settled on her face. A warm glow settled over her green eyes, and she raised her hands to straighten Sean's heavy coat while she talked to him. "You have enough to do here. The king can't just leave his post, right? We're going to be fine. You know me well enough. I'll survive anything and no one will get too close to our daughter." At that, Sean also quieted down a bit before nodding slowly again. "Yes. You're probably right. Of course I'm right. You should have learned that by now, right?" Amused, she ran her hand over his coat again briefly before she also stepped back from him and walked over to the door of the carriage. But before doing so, she turned to face him once more. "Just make sure Liam doesn't get into any mischief, okay? You think anyone could do that? He's your son, after all." But the only response Sean got to his little tease was a short and quiet laugh before Jenna also joined Hannah in the carriage. Now Sean had to smile as well, while he took one last look at Antonio, who was also getting ready to leave. And then he only had to take a step back before he could watch how the journey of the 3 began. He was glad that at least Antonio was accompanying them. As his right-hand man, he was the one to whom he would still be most likely to entrust his family. Chapter 5. Scarlet and Eden. Scarlet, How much longer are we going to be on the road? See those tall towers up ahead? That's where we're going. That's where we'll stay again for a while and find somewhere cozy to spend the night. At least, she very much hoped it was that easy. With a warm voice and a slight smile on her face, the young Scarlet talked to her little sister, who was happily walking along beside her. Her long, slightly reddish and wavy hair was mostly hidden under a cap covered by a thin layer of snow. They had been on the road for a while since they left their last shelter behind. Until today, they had stayed for a few days in a small village, in a huge patch of forest in the middle of the Corinth countryside, with an elderly couple who were very happy to have people around them once again. They especially enjoyed the little 8-year-old Eden, whom they took care of as if she were their own granddaughter. But unfortunately, Scarlet had to end their happiness sooner than expected, and since then they have been back on the road to the next place where they could safely stay for a while. All the way to the front yet? That's going to take forever, came the immediate reply, however, while Eden looked ahead with wide eyes and open mouth, where in the far distance the roofs of many houses rose towards the sky. They would have to walk for a while before they got there. Scarlet was sure, however, that they would arrive in the big city today, even if Eden almost fell asleep while walking then. Indeed, it would not be the first time. More often Scarlet carried little Eden the last bit, because they were on the road longer than she had expected before. But Eden's words elicited only a short laugh from Scarlet as she shook her head. As she did so, individual snowflakes fell from her red, equally wavy hair, which reached just above her ears, which were already quite cold from the chilly wind that blew past them. For Scarlet, it was more important that Eden didn't get too cold, which is why she had given up her hat to her at the beginning of her journey. She also did her best not to show her how she occasionally shivered under her clothes, because she didn't want to worry her. Unfortunately, they were just stepping out of the protective shade of the forest where they had spent the last few days, which only made the wind seem cooler. The sun that occasionally shone through the cloud cover didn't yet have enough power to warm up the world down here, but despite the cold, Scarlet didn't let on. It won't take that long, believe me. We've already made it a big part of the way. And once we get there, we'll find someplace to warm up right away, yeah? At that, the young Eden turned back towards her big sister, looking her curiously in the eye as they continued to walk along the path that connected the different towns. Can we eat something then? I'm hungry, but of course. I'm sure we'll find something delicious, replied Scarlet immediately with her warm tone, giggling once again briefly at the sight of Eden's expectant face. She had discovered over the time of the last years that above all amusement could cover her worries, which always ran just a small step behind them. So Eden learned nothing of her thoughts. Where we're going, you won't even be able to decide what to eat first. There's everything there. They say they even have specialties from Adriel and Rhodes. You won't get anything like that anywhere else here in Corinth. Really? Immediately, curiosity showed in Eden's eyes, and Scarlet could see her forgetting the cold surroundings and her own hunger as she focused on imagining the next few days. Really? And what else is there? What kind of town is it? Expectantly, she turned forward again, letting her gaze slide up to the cluster of many houses they were slowly approaching. And Scarlet was only too happy to let herself in on it. With a mysterious and somewhat dramatic undertone, she began to narrate. The city we are approaching, Eden. It's the largest trading city on this continent. If you want to walk through it from one side to the other, you'll be at least half a day. What, really? Again Eden turned, this time even more wide-eyed, to Scarlet, who only nodded in amusement and then continued speaking. Her name is Wolens. And it has the perfect location for all kinds of business you can imagine. Besides, if you stand in Wolens and look across the sea, you can see right to Paldar. You know what's special about this town? Yes. I heard that in a story. That's where the king lives, isn't it? Eden was completely engrossed in her big sister's tale, eagerly grasping to learn something new. Yes, that's right. But not our king. The king of Corinth lives in Surmaz, on the island to the west. In Paldar lives the king of Rhodes, the vast land that occupies the whole south. If you look in that direction, everything you see on the horizon belongs to Rhodes. And we're heading straight for the town closest to the border between the two countries. There was no reply to these words. Instead, Eden just looked ahead again with her mouth slightly open, contemplating the landscape before them. You could tell in her gaze that she was trying to imagine the vastness of this foreign land. You know, Scarlett then added with a thoughtful tone. I was thinking about whether we should go to Rhodes sometime. What do you think about it, huh? We stay in Wolens for a few days and then we take a little trip to Paldar? Or to Tramis, which is the second largest city in Rhodes. And immediately a new joy showed on Eden's childish face, and she nodded quickly. Yes, please. That was a very clear agreement. With that, Scarlett set her plan and looked ahead again as well, with a small smile on her face. Rhodes was probably the safest country they could be in at the moment. Since a different king ruled there than here, different rules prevailed there. They could start over again, and maybe they would even find a place where they could stay longer than a few weeks. Moreover, they would have it easier there than here. Not only because they were safer there, but also because the weather was more pleasant there. It would soon get warmer there, and they said the snow disappeared there many weeks before the rest of the continent. She wanted to give Eden a better trip, so that she could continue to grow up carefree, and for that they first had to escape this winter that slowed their steps and froze the dew on the plants. Chapter 6. Kuno. Paralyzing cold and darkness settled over the isolated houses of the village that lay before Kuno, so that he saw only the rough outlines of the stone walls and roofs over which the snow lay. His path led him through the vast forest in the middle of Corinth, which is why he was mostly protected from the snowstorm that had unexpectedly and suddenly fallen upon them. After the last few days of almost constant sunshine, no one would have expected such weather to happen again. Most would hide in their homes during this storm, but Kuno didn't mind the cold. He has had to endure much worse, and his heavy coat ensured his survival in this icy world around him. The small village in front of him, which was hidden between the huge and dark trees, he had never entered before, but there had to be something there where he could rest. At least until tomorrow morning, before his journey continued. Even if he would certainly hold out until tomorrow, he did not want to take any unnecessary risk. He certainly still needed his strength, because you never knew what unexpected events would happen. Fortunately, his expectations seemed to be fulfilled, because no sooner had he ventured a few steps into the village than he saw that the windows in one of the small houses were lit up. He heard soft music coming from that direction, and when he stepped closer and looked through the light snow flurry into the sparsely lit room through one of the windows, he recognized about a dozen people sitting spread out at old and massive wooden tables, drinking and talking to each other. It seemed to be a pub. With that, his stay was at least safe for now. He did not hesitate any longer, but immediately made his way to the small, barely recognizable entrance door, before he already stepped through it. Immediately, the stale and warm air of the pub took hold of him, mixed with the strong smell of alcohol. The voices of the other few people were also louder than before, almost drowning out the soft music playing in the far corner of the large room. He didn't linger long on the trivia, but went right ahead to the short bar, where he stood at the only empty seat, between two already visibly drunk, slightly older men. "Is there anything to eat here?" he asked quietly, addressing the waitress, who was drying a few glasses with a dirty rag. It was again a man. But this one was much younger than the other two, and had a rather inconspicuous and featureless appearance. Therefore, he did not leave a lasting impression. He immediately directed his gaze forward, his stringy blonde hair falling into his eyes, and at the sight of Kuno, he only nodded quickly. You could tell by the look on his face that he immediately had respect for him, but that was probably the best thing that could happen to him here. As soon as you had someone with a dangerously tall and broad stature similar to Kuno's in front of you, you should be rather cautious, because there were enough dangerous people around here who would pull out their weapons at the slightest insolence. What's more, Kuno was almost completely hooded, having put on the hood of his heavy coat and pulled his dark scarf up over his nose because of the snowstorm. "Give me something then. Anything." And right after those words, the boy nodded again, but before he disappeared into the small back room, he says quickly and quietly, "I'll take it to your place." And already he was gone and Kuno could go to a quieter place, at least a little secluded from the other people here. He really couldn't be called outgoing. Most of the time, other people were more of a burden to him, which he liked to avoid as often as possible. Just as he turned away from the counter to go into the room and look for a free table somewhere at the edge, he was suddenly stopped. A tight grip closed around his arm, preventing him from going any further. But he hardly showed any reaction to it. Instead, he waited silently for a moment, sighing once in annoyance, before slowly turning his head to the side, where one of the older men sitting next to him at the counter looked at him. He looked strong, despite his age, which could be seen in his wrinkled skin and gray hair. His hair of medium length was combed back, and a thick beard covered a large part of his face. In addition, the unpleasant pungent smell of alcohol immediately hit Kuno from the stranger's direction. "I don't see someone like you around here very often," he heard it from him then, actually quite clearly and distinctly, despite his drinking behavior today. But that was no surprise. Just about all the people in this area could withstand a great many drinks before they began to show impairment. He had even met a few people who were in better shape after a long night at the pub than they were before. "Say, from your looks, you could be a bounty hunter. Am I right or am I right? I came here to eat." Nothing more, was then Kuno's only neutral answer, and he simply wrenched his arm from the stranger's grip. He had not planned to say anything further. He then looked for a brief moment into the face of the older man, whose features became a bit more sinister and displeased, before he already turned around and made his way through the dark room. He had nothing to fear from him. Within the last years he had already met a lot of people, and had learned to estimate people. He really didn't have to worry about an old, gray-haired man who had already passed his best years and spent his time drinking alone in some old pub and watching people. It would take him only a few steps before he dropped behind a wide wooden column, in a slightly darker corner, at a small and free table. Only a few glances of the others followed him, before they turned again to their own occupation. Sporadically, he could still hear a soft whisper, but it quickly disappeared. In the next moment he noticed how the young waitress came in his direction, and a little later put down a plate in front of him. He didn't say anything about it, but he didn't need to. He wasn't here for any insincere polite phrases, but simply to strengthen himself and warm up. With a short movement he put a few coins on the waiter's hand, of which he gave him 2 back, and put the rest into his small shoulder bag. Then he already turned away again. On his way back, however, Kuno immediately heard himself being stopped by 2 other young adults. "Hey, kid. The food here is already cold. That's not how I ordered it. Sorry. I'll bring you something new. Better that way. But make it snappy. I don't have forever." Along the way, Kuno slowly and calmly picked up his silverware before looking ahead and still watching the boy bow, and then disappear toward the counter with the guest's half-filled plate. And no sooner was he gone than a grin spread across the face of the man who had just sent him back. "It's as simple as that, see? As soon as the old man isn't around to pay attention, he'll do anything you want. Food on the house. You can't get much better than that. The two burst into quiet laughter and raised their glasses, euphoric and triumphant by their apparent cunning and intelligent idea. But this did not last long. Through the door where the boy with the plate had just disappeared, someone else suddenly appeared. He was almost a giant. With his broad shoulders, he just fit through the narrow, wooden door frame, and he also had to pull his head in a little. This made him appear even taller. His black hair fell slightly tangled to his shoulders, and he had a large scar on his face that reached over his left eye. He didn't seem to be the owner of this pub. But Kuno immediately had another idea when he saw him. It is said that a few years ago there was a legendary bounty hunter in this area who outshone all previous ones. Even Kuno would have to be lucky to stand a chance against him. But some time ago, he had retired for unknown reasons and disappeared from the scene. Only from time to time people reported to have seen him somewhere in the area. With heavy steps he walked towards the table of the two, even the other people suddenly being silent and looking towards him. Just the sight of his serious face left a huge impression, and no one dared to oppose him. "Is there a problem?" his deep, calm voice rang out, while Kuno, unlike so many other guests, remained calmly seated, not allowing himself to be disturbed. The two, who had just been celebrating themselves so triumphantly, also seemed to have immediately lost their sudden cheerfulness. "And no problem. Everything's fine." "Good, then give me payment for your food." Along the way, he also extended his hand forward to the table of the two unhappy guests, whose spokesman looked nervously at his comrade for a moment before slowly turning back. "But we've already paid. You ordered something else new, didn't you? Then give me the money for it." Apparently, the two of them became even more nervous now, before they suddenly stood up. At the same time, one of them raised his hands defensively and surrenderingly at the same time. "No, it's all right. We don't need anything more. We better go now." And thereupon they also immediately turned around and quickly made off. As Kuno knew such people, they didn't even have enough money with them to pay for their food. Therefore, it was probably the best decision to leave on their own before they were thrown out. Everything you do eventually takes its revenge. With examples like this, one was always reminded. Kuno now turned back to his food, but on the side still had an eye on this giant, who slowly walked back into the room behind the counter. You could also immediately feel relief move through the patrons. "I've never seen this guy here before. That's creepy," it was still heard quietly in some distance from the back rows of the pub. "Yeah, really. Then I guess they made sure there was a chaperone here. But that only makes sense too. With the freezing weather and the problems with trade, things aren't so good for our supplies. You can't let anything get stolen because otherwise it's going to look bad. Right. Somehow we all have to make ends meet." In fact, Kuno had already noticed that. In the last villages where he had stayed temporarily, all the way to the large capital Surmaz, there were also already shortages in supplies, and the wealthier people were under constant tension that someone might attack them. In addition, he himself had already witnessed how a group of traders were stopped on their way. All that remained were abandoned and destroyed carriages. So it was obvious that this pub was also looking for a way to get through the crisis more safely. But that they got help for this from such an impressive fighter was quite an achievement. At least someone here wouldn't dare play against the rules so quickly. That was good. Kuno had his peace. That was all I wanted. He was able to finish his meal without further incident. There was also nothing exciting to listen to in the rest of the conversations. The others all very quickly returned to normal and talked about the current events of their lives or the area here, and this information was not exactly useful to Kuno. Still, he remained attentive, for perhaps something hidden and helpful could be found after all. Promptly he had to think again of the older man at the counter who had stopped him earlier. Bounty hunter. He wasn't that wrong. He had a good eye for that kind of thing, and he also seemed to have a lot of courage to ask Kuno that. Not everyone dared to do that. He straightened his coat and pulled his scarf back up over his nose as a precaution, ready to go back outside and look for a place to spend the night. If there was nothing, he would return here and pass the time at one of the tables, hoping not to be disturbed there. But before he could even get up, something else caught his attention.